Welcome, traveler. If you found yourself here tonight, perhaps you're looking for a quiet place to rest your thoughts, a moment of peace, away from the noise and weight of the waking world. Or maybe, like so many who came before you, you're simply hungry for a story, one that won't jolt or race but unfold like candlelight on a stone wall. So, breathe, settle in, and if you find yourself drifting off before the end, that's perfectly fine. The story will wait. But before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet journeys through the forgotten corners of history, consider leaving a like or subscribing. It helps more than you know, and I'd be honored to have you along for the next one. Tonight, we're traveling not to castles or battlefields, but to somewhere much humbler and stranger. We're heading to the cobbled streets of a medieval town, through the scent of wood smoke and frying fat, toward one of history's least discussed and most peculiar cravings: junk food. Yes, junk food. That indulgent, greasy, often unnecessary bite you didn't need, but somehow couldn't resist. It turns out the Middle Ages had its own versions, and they weren't that different from ours. In fact, some were disturbingly familiar. Others were unlike anything you'd ever want near your mouth. And nearly all of them had stories worth telling. But to understand medieval snacking, we have to start with something simple: hunger, the kind that sits in your bones, especially in winter. Most people in medieval Europe weren't choosing between sushi and burgers. They were choosing between going hungry or eating the same stew 4 nights in a row. A hot pie or sticky pastry on the street wasn't just a treat. It was survival wrapped in dough. Picture it: a small English market town around the year 1340. The air smells of damp wool and wood smoke. Children chase chickens between muddy stalls. Somewhere, a lute is being played with more enthusiasm than talent. And over the chatter and clatter, there's the unmistakable sizzle of oil, deep, bubbling, dark, and the smell of something frying. That something might have been a fritter. Not the kind we think of today, with powdered sugar and apple chunks, but a lump of dough. Sometimes with cheese or herbs, sometimes with leftover meat, dropped into hot fat and served scorching. The kind of snack you eat with your fingers and regret only when the oil seeps through the cloth of your sleeve. Or maybe it was a honey cake. Cheap flour, boiled and pressed with spices if you were lucky. Sticky, dense, and meant to fill your belly, not impress your palate. Vendors didn't sell these things from neon-lit shops or food trucks. They had wooden carts, some with iron griddles heated by coal. The food wasn't just fast. It was theater: smoke rising, grease popping, and the vendor shouting over the crowd, praising the crispness of his pies or the sweetness of his wafers. Some even wore colorful clothes and sang verses, like early advertisers in rhyme. But junk food wasn't only for the poor. Wealthier townsfolk, and the occasional noble in disguise, craved it too, especially when it came with sugar. Sugar in the medieval world was exotic, imported, dangerous, some said. A medicine before it was a luxury. But once it arrived, it didn't take long for people to start abusing it. Imagine a sweetmeat stall in a bustling city like Bruges or Paris. Little cubes of pressed almonds and honey, dyed pink with beetroot or green with herbs, laid out like jewelry. For a silver coin, you could get enough sweetness to last a week, or a toothache that lasted longer. And then there were waffles. Yes, medieval waffles. Thin, crispy, cooked in irons over a flame. The irons themselves were engraved with religious scenes or floral designs, imprinting each snack with a kind of holiness, or maybe just good branding. Street waffles were common near churches during feast days. Eaten plain or smeared with soft cheese or fruit paste, They were a rare delight in a world where dinner was often gruel. All of it, fritters, tarts, spiced cakes, roasted nuts, sweet buns, was technically food, but not food in the sacred sense. Not bread and wine, not porridge or stew or roasted game. These were distractions, pleasures, guilty ones if you asked a priest. Some towns even tried to regulate them. Bakers had to follow rules about what they could sell and when. Frying oil had to be reused, stretched across days or weeks. More than one vendor was fined for using rancid fat. And yet the customers kept coming. Because sometimes, when your day began before dawn and ended with your hands cracked from labor, when the firewood was wet and the sky was gray and the Lord hadn't paid wages in a month, what you needed most was not virtue or health or even a full meal. You needed a moment, a bite, something warm and rich and slightly sinful. And so the medieval junk food trade thrived. Outside the abbey gates near the town square, in alleys too narrow for carts but wide enough for a frying pan, you'd find them. The smell led the way. The promise of comfort pulled you closer. In the next part of our journey, we'll look more closely at what made these snacks so tempting. Not just the ingredients, but the way they reflected the hopes, fears, and secret hungers of a society built on faith and famine. But for now, breathe. Let the market sounds fade. Let the scent of grease and spice drift into your dreams. There's more to come. Let's return to the market, where the smoke still hangs low and the voices echo off timbered walls. It's morning again, or what passes for morning, just after the second bell, when the town begins to stir. And if you were a laborer, a washerwoman, or a boy running errands, your stomach might already be reminding you of its emptiness. Breakfast in the Middle Ages was rarely a meal. It was more of a negotiation. Whatever was warm, nearby, and could be eaten quickly. This is where street food found its rhythm. For the average medieval citizen, home kitchens were often dark, smoky, and primitive. There was no pantry stocked with ingredients, no ovens unless you were very lucky, and even firewood could be a luxury. So for many, cooking wasn't something done every day. Instead, they bought food from vendors, cheap, ready, and just greasy enough to feel like indulgence. One of the most beloved snacks was a sort of proto-donut. They were called crumpets in England, frittelle in Italy, beignets in France. The names changed, but the idea was constant. A batter of flour, water, and sometimes egg dropped into bubbling fat. What emerged was golden, crisp on the outside and soft within. Sometimes herbs were mixed in, or bits of onion. Sometimes, for a festival, they'd be sweetened with honey or dried fruit. You could eat one in 3 bites and hold it in a scrap of linen or paper. And yes, it was best eaten hot. So hot it burned your tongue if you were impatient, which you probably were. Then there were pies. Not the ornate, lidded sort you'd find at a banquet, but squat, leathery little things called chewits, or pasties. The dough was often tough and designed to be thrown away. What mattered was the filling. Cabbage, minced meat, fish scraps, lentils, even mashed turnips. Some vendors knew how to spice them just enough to mask the sourness of ingredients slightly past their best. These pies were not pretty, but they were warm, and in winter warm was everything. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, waffles had already taken on an almost sacred role in local culture. Made from simple batter, they were poured into iron molds and pressed over flame until crisp. Some were served plain. Others came layered with soft cheeses, melted apples, or herbs. A few were shaped like roses or crosses, depending on the season. Vendors sold them near churches on feast days, turning holy occasions into a chance for sweet indulgence. There was something deeply human about it, savoring a treat just after confession. Elsewhere, in towns like Florence and Ghent, a morning might begin with roasted chickpeas. Vendors carried them in wide brass pans, salted and shaken over coals. A copper scoop, a handful in your pouch, and you were off. Children especially loved them, crunching as they ran down the alleys, chased by the smell of stewing onions and garlic. In colder climates, fermented grain porridge might be sold by the ladle. Piping hot and sour from age, it stuck to your ribs and coated your fingers. You could pay a little more to add a splash of ale, or crumbled cheese, or a piece of salted fish. It was rough food, but honest, and deeply regional. Still, not everything was savory. A strange kind of candied fruit existed. Apples or pears boiled in honey, then rolled in herbs or sometimes ash to preserve them. They were sold in little packets wrapped in parchment and eaten slowly like lozenges. One bite was enough. Too much, and you risked a headache. Or worse, depending on the sweetness. Even milk had its street food moment. Not fresh milk, which spoiled too fast, but thickened milk curds. These could be spiced with nutmeg or pepper and shaped into patties. In England, they called them clotted cream cakes. In France, fromage frit. They were always controversial. Loved by children, scorned by doctors. Monks, in particular, warned against eating dairy from carts. Heated the humors, they claimed, and led to gluttony. But people bought them anyway. The vendors themselves were often as colorful as their wares. Some sang, some shouted rhymes, others wore bells or feathers to stand out in the crowd. In London, food sellers were banned from making too much noise, but few listened. Competition was fierce. The best corners, near guildhalls, wells, or bridges, were jealously guarded. Some even bribed city guards for the right to park their carts. Children learned early where the best vendors stood. The woman with the plum tarts, always at the south end of the market. The man who sold cinnamon wafers by the church steps. The girl who fried chestnuts and hummed under her breath. They were part of the fabric of daily life, as familiar as the town bell or the smell of baking rye. But this was still a world without refrigeration, and not every snack was safe. There were rules, of course. In Paris, street cooks were inspected weekly. In Milan, meat pies had to be marked with a seal. In London, anyone caught using spoiled ingredients could be pilloried or fined. Still, accidents, or outright fraud, happened. Bread made with chalk to whiten it. Pies filled with cat or crow. Oil reused until it smoked black. Some towns had taste testers, appointed to sample street food before festivals. It was a dangerous job. In 1293, the tester of York died after sampling a honey cake laced with nightshade. The vendor vanished that night and was never found, and yet the craving never went away. The need for something fast, warm, slightly decadent. A reminder that even in hard times, people wanted not just to survive, but to enjoy, to taste, to indulge. In many ways, medieval junk food was a rebellion against hunger, against the dullness of porridge, against the rules of the church and the fear of sin. It was defiance wrapped in dough. As we move forward, we'll step into the world of the wealthy, where junk food wasn't sold from a cart, but served on silver, where sugar became spectacle, and eating was an art of excess. But for now, let the morning market settle behind you. The stalls are closing, the fires are dimming, and the town is slowing once more. You've tasted what the streets had to offer. Soon you'll see how the other half feasted. Imagine now that you are no longer in the crowd. no longer jostled by elbows or warmed by the shared heat of market stalls. Instead, you step through carved wooden doors into a manor lit by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of beeswax candles. The floors are polished stone, and the scent that greets you is not wood smoke or sweat, but rosewater, cinnamon, and roasting meat. This is not the world of the street. This is the domain of the elite. And here, junk food took a very different form. To the medieval nobility, food was never just nourishment. It was theater. It was status. And it was power. What you served and what you ate said more about your place in the world than your name or your title. That's why the meals of the upper class were often exercises in extravagance, meant to dazzle, to shock, even to intimidate. Take sugar, for instance. In the 13th and 14th centuries, sugar was worth more than gold. It came in lumps, hard and dark, and had to be boiled, pounded, and purified before it could be used. But for those who could afford it, sugar became the centerpiece of culinary display. Noble banquets often ended with something called subtleties. These weren't subtle at all. They were sculptures made entirely of sugar, castles, animals, religious scenes, painted with saffron and dyed with beetroot or spinach juice. Some were even mechanical, a sugar swan that flapped its wings, or a knight that lifted a lance. They weren't always meant to be eaten. They were symbols, proof that the host could afford to waste what others only dreamed of tasting. Then there were sweetmeats, candied fennel, almonds, violets, and rose petals preserved in honey or syrup. They were served in tiny silver dishes and eaten slowly, with fingers or jewel-handled knives. To be seen eating them was a kind of performance, delicate, refined, entirely impractical. They did little to fill the stomach, but everything to impress a guest. Junk food for the nobility wasn't about hunger. It was about whim, and whim had its own chefs. The royal kitchens of France and England employed dozens of cooks, bakers, sauce-makers, and sweetmeat specialists. These weren't ordinary laborers. They were artisans, trained to combine spice and sugar in impossible ways, to shape almond paste into birds, or to boil down fruit until it formed translucent sheets, folded like parchment. Some of their creations still exist in distant forms today. Marzipan, for example, was once a luxury so expensive it was served only on feast days, not as a candy, but as art. Tiny animals, portraits, or family crests. One noble family in Venice commissioned a marzipan model of their own house, complete with sugar glass windows. It was admired for an hour before being devoured by the guests, piece by piece. Roasted fruits were another indulgence. Pears and apples baked in sweet wine, served hot with cream, or folded into pies with cloves and saffron. The crusts were often discarded, not because they were inedible, but because they were plebeian. To touch the crust was to admit hunger. Better to scoop the filling out with a spoon and leave the rest behind. Even drinks became desserts. Spiced wine, called hippocras, was served warm with candied nuts floating in it, or a mixture of milk and honey and crushed dates, thick as custard, flavored with imported cinnamon and sprinkled with gold leaf. Yes, gold, not edible, tasteless, utterly useless gold. It served no purpose but to gleam on the lips and remind everyone at the table. Here sits someone for whom waste is wealth. But even the most opulent kitchens had a darker side. Not all noble indulgences were meant for guests. Some foods were consumed in secret, at odd hours, or in quantities that shocked even their cooks. One 14th century duchess was said to have a chamber closet off her bedroom, filled with candied orange peels, rose jellies, and barley sugar. Servants were instructed to replenish it nightly and to say nothing. Another lord reportedly demanded fried pastries at midnight, every night, even during Lent, when such things were forbidden. The kitchen kept a second fire going, hidden just in case he called. There were rumors, of course, that certain nobles had eating rooms built below their bedchambers, accessible by trapdoor, that they held private feasts with rare meats, aphrodisiac roots, and liquors banned by the church, that they consumed sugar not just in food, but as powder, snorted or dissolved in wine, claimed to bring visions and laughter. Some of it may have been true. Some may have been jealousy or propaganda. But there's no denying that food, for the rich, was power in edible form. The most famous royal indulgence might belong to King Henry VIII, whose feasts were legendary. At one banquet, the centerpiece was a pie filled with live birds, released when the crust was cut. At another, a sugar model of the Tower of London was set on fire during dessert, revealing almond prisoners inside. It was spectacle. It was waste. And yet it worked. To witness such a display was to understand your place. To consume such food was to become untouchable, if only for a moment. And still there were whispers in the chapel halls, among the monks and priests who saw these luxuries as rot wearing silk. They called it gluttony, one of the 7 deadliest sins, a sign that even kings might fall. Next, we'll step away from the banquet tables and into the stillness of stone cloisters, where food meant something entirely different, where simplicity was sacred and appetite was a test of the soul. But for now, let the fire die low. The silver trays have been cleared, the candles have burned down, and the taste of sugar, real or imagined, lingers just a little longer. The banquet fades. The gilded platters, the sugar beasts, the sweetmeats pressed into delicate forms, vanished into memory. Now we step into silence. Heavy, deliberate, sacred. Stone corridors replace carved oak. The only light comes from narrow windows or the flicker of oil lamps. And in the air, instead of spice or roasting meat, there's the faint scent of candle wax and old parchment. We have entered a monastery. For much of medieval Europe, these were places outside of time. Here, the body was not to be indulged, but tamed. The tongue not delighted, but disciplined. And food, though necessary, was never to become a pleasure. In the monasteries of Cluny or Chartres, of Glastonbury or Einsiedeln, meals were taken in silence. Not quiet, silence, absolute. A monk would read aloud from Scripture or the life of a saint while the others ate, their wooden spoons tapping bowls with a rhythm that echoed in the vaulted halls. To eat too quickly was a fault. To reach for more than your share, a warning, and to ask for second helpings, unthinkable. This was not just etiquette, it was theology. Gluttony, in the eyes of the Church, was one of the 7 deadliest sins. Not simply overeating, but any disordered desire for food, craving luxury, insisting on special preparations, or taking pleasure in eating more than necessary. It was not the size of the portion, but the hunger of the soul behind it that mattered. St. Gregory the Great once described 5 ways gluttony could manifest: eating too early, too expensively, too eagerly, too much, or with too much attention to preparation. Under this definition, even a monk who savored his turnip soup with too much satisfaction risked damnation. It seems severe. But for the medieval mind, food was a spiritual matter. What entered the body shaped the soul, and to be ruled by appetite was to risk letting the devil set the table. This did not mean that monasteries starved. In fact, Many were centers of agriculture and husbandry. They brewed beer, made cheese, cultivated orchards. They had wine cellars and granaries, herb gardens and fish ponds. But what they produced was meant to serve the rule. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monastic orders, prescribed 2 meals a day. Meat from 4-legged animals was forbidden except to the sick. Wine was permitted, but in moderation. "A pint a day is enough," he wrote, though monks should be content without it. Meals were built around bread, legumes, and vegetables. If fish or eggs were served, it was often only on feast days. There was variety, but not indulgence. And yet, even here, in this world of restraint, loopholes crept in. The strictest rules applied only to the refectory, the public dining hall. But many monasteries had a second space, known as the misericorde, or room of mercy. Here, the rules could be relaxed for the ill or elderly. A monk too weak for lentils might be served chicken broth. Another, recovering from illness, might have a poached egg or a bit of cheese. Over time, the misericorde became a place of quiet compromise. And as donations and wealth flowed into certain orders, some of these rooms grew lavish. Chronicles from the 14th century speak of French abbeys, where monks dined on trout stuffed with almonds, or baked pears in spiced wine, behind closed doors. They justified it, of course, that the soul needed strength, that charity must begin at home, that comfort helped meditation, and perhaps it did. But to the stricter voices, like the Cistercians, these were dangerous signs. The beginning of rot. The path from devotion to decadence. Beyond the walls, peasants and pilgrims watched with curiosity, and sometimes bitterness. The monks who preached humility were fat, it was said, their robes strained at the seams. They warned against gluttony while sipping imported wine. But this was not the whole story. In many smaller monasteries, especially in harsher regions, the life remained severe. Meals were sparse. Bread might be stale. Vegetables pickled or boiled until gray. Salt was precious. Oil, a memory. The hunger was real, and spiritual pride was often the only seasoning. And yet even here, the pull of taste could not be fully silenced. There are records of monks confessing to dreams, literal dreams, of roast goose, of fresh figs, of warm pastries. One scribe in York wrote a letter to his superior, asking for forgiveness after sneaking into the kitchen to lick the spoon used to stir honey. Another wrote an entire homily on the danger of apples, citing not just the fall of man, but the way one apple could linger in the mind for days, distracting from prayer. Fasting was the ultimate tool against these temptations. Entire months of the liturgical calendar were structured around it. Lent, Advent, Ember Days. For some orders, up to half the year was spent in some form of abstinence, not just from meat, but from eggs, dairy, and even olive oil. The idea was simple. When the body is emptied, the soul can be filled. But of course, humans are rarely simple. The monasteries adapted. They reclassified animals. Beavers, for instance, because they lived in water, were considered fish by some monks, and thus acceptable during fasts. So were puffins, otters, even barnacle geese, whose mysterious nesting habits led some to believe they were born from trees or driftwood. Thus, the table was rebalanced. Not broken, just adjusted. Because even within cloisters, the line between discipline and desire was thin. As you let this part of the journey settle, imagine the hush of the refectory, the scrape of bowls, the flick of candlelight across stone. Even here, far from the clamor of the marketplace or the gluttony of the court, food remained powerful. A need, a temptation, a prayer. Next, we will leave the cloisters and turn our eyes to something the monks both feared and preached against: decay. Not just spiritual, but physical. Spoiled food. Dangerous ingredients. The poisons that sometimes masqueraded as pleasure. But for now, close your eyes. The candles are out. The hunger, for the moment, is gone. Let us now drift from the quiet cloisters into a space even more elusive. A space between hunger and healing. Between survival and science. A place where food was not just sustenance, not just temptation, but medicine. Because while some dined to indulge, and others fasted to cleanse the soul, many in the medieval world approached food with something else in mind: balance. You see, medieval health was not defined by calories or vitamins. There was no talk of protein, cholesterol, or fiber. Instead, wellness was understood through the ancient doctrine of the humors, four bodily fluids believed to govern every aspect of life: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Each was associated with elements, seasons, even moods. And health, they believed, meant balance. Food, then, was more than fuel. It was a tool to restore harmony. Every ingredient was classified as hot or cold, moist or dry, not based on temperature or texture, but on its perceived effect on the body. Lettuce, cold and moist. Pepper, hot and dry. Bread, depending on how it was baked, could swing either way. Physicians, and there were many, especially among the educated elite, consulted detailed food tables to prescribe diets. Feeling melancholic? You might be given pears, goat's milk, or trout. Too choleric? Quick-tempered, restless? Then soft bread soaked in rosewater or boiled barley. They believed that even the time of year changed how food affected you. In winter, warming dishes were preferred: leeks, garlic, boiled beef. In summer, cooling meals: cucumber, chicken, soft cheese. Spring called for purging greens, like sorrel or nettle. Autumn demanded grounding: roots, beans, thick porridge. This philosophy wasn't limited to scholars. Many ordinary people, especially in towns, followed seasonal rhythms without even naming them. They ate garlic in winter not because of vitamins, but because it heated the chest. They drank vinegar water in summer to cool the liver. And at the heart of this idea was something surprisingly familiar to us now: moderation. Too much of anything, even honey, was dangerous. Too much wine could make the blood overheat. Too many beans might fill the stomach with vapors and cloud the mind. In fact, a surprising amount of what we'd call healthy eating today existed, albeit through different reasoning: greens, herbs, soups, grains. They made up the majority of daily meals for peasants and monks alike. Whole grains were more common than refined flours. Watered wine was considered safer than raw water, but strong spirits were rare and often discouraged. Freshness mattered, too, not in terms of bacteria, which they didn't understand, but in the sense that new food was closer to nature and thus more spiritually pure. The concept of detoxing also had its echoes. Fasting, of course, but also bitter herbs meant to cleanse the bile, or spring tonics made from boiled dandelions and nettles. In some regions, vinegar mixed with garlic and sage was taken each morning as a preventative. Not pleasant, but believed to be fortifying. There were even proto-superfoods. Quince, for example, was praised for calming the stomach and sharpening the mind. Figs were thought to purify the blood. Pomegranate juice was prescribed for heartache. Literal and romantic. One of the most respected authorities of the time was Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess and mystic who wrote extensively on the medicinal properties of food. She believed that spelt, a hardy grain, was the most perfect nourishment. She recommended fennel to improve digestion and bring joy. Nutmeg, in moderation, was said to open the heart. But of course, not all advice was so poetic. Some cures were strange, eating roasted owl to cure gout, wrapping a slice of cheese around the foot to draw out fever, drinking the broth of boiled antlers to restore virility. Still, at its core, medieval healthy eating was cautious, practical, and deeply tied to observation. People knew which foods gave them strength, which slowed them down, which comforted or unsettled. And it wasn't just about the body. A meal was also a spiritual act, beginning with a prayer, taken in company, eaten with gratitude, not greed. To eat too much, even of good food, was to risk pride. To hoard was to show mistrust in divine provision. To waste was a sin. One fascinating tradition was the almsgiving meal. On feast days, wealthy families would prepare simple meals and distribute them to the poor, not out of pity, but as part of their own penance. It was believed that sharing food, especially healthy, humble food, could cleanse the soul. But even in this world of balance and restraint, taste could not be entirely ignored. Herbs were used not just for health, but flavor. Mint, sage, thyme, marjoram. Honey, not sugar, was the sweetener of choice. Fruit was dried or stewed. Nuts were toasted and ground into pastes, and there were moments, brief, rare, when food was simply enjoyed. Imagine a countryside evening. The day's work is done. A bowl of warm broth, a slice of black bread, a handful of dried cherries. Someone starts humming a hymn. A child leans against their mother's side. A fire cracks, and the food, for just a moment, becomes more than function. It becomes comfort. In our next step, we'll look at what happened when food turned dangerous. Not from sin, but from spoilage, fraud, or fear. Because in a world without refrigeration or regulation, not every meal was a blessing. For now, let your thoughts rest in the warmth of the hearth. Let the rhythm of careful, mindful eating settle into your breath. You are nourished. You are safe. Not all food in the medieval world brought comfort. Some meals lingered not on the tongue, but in the belly as unease. Some left behind more than satisfaction, fever, dizziness, even death. Because for every lovingly stirred pottage, there was a pie kept too long on a summer's day. For every golden fritter from a market stall, a pot of oil blackened by overuse. And in a time before germ theory or refrigeration, danger often wore the mask of indulgence. Spoiled food was a daily risk. Preservation techniques were few and fallible. Smoking, salting, pickling, drying. Each had its uses, but none guaranteed safety. A cut of meat left too long in brine could grow slimy. Dried fruits stored in damp cellars sprouted mold. Even bread, if made with spoiled flour or left uncovered, became a breeding ground for rot. And when illness followed a meal, as it often did, people searched for meaning. Sometimes they blamed the cook, sometimes the ingredients. But often they looked for hidden hands, poisoners, sorcerers, or fate itself. Food poisoning wasn't understood, but it was feared. A nobleman struck down after a feast might have been a victim of politics. A child who fell ill after a meat pie, evidence of sin in the household. And so emerged a culture of suspicion. Tasters became common in wealthy households. Servants, often young boys, were ordered to sample food before it reached the table. If they fell ill, the meal was discarded. It was cruel, but considered necessary. Some courts went further, using silver cutlery, believing it would darken in the presence of poison. Bread was torn, not cut, to avoid hidden blades or powders. certain ingredients gained reputations, sometimes deserved, sometimes not. Mushrooms, for instance, were both delicacy and danger. Some were gathered carefully and praised for their rich flavor. Others, nearly identical in appearance, were fatal. Without books or microscopes, knowledge passed mouth to mouth, and even the most experienced forager could be wrong. Fish, too, posed a threat. Eaten out of season or caught in foul water, it could sicken an entire table. Shellfish were the worst. Prized in coastal towns but quick to spoil. A single bad mussel could bring fever, vomiting, and in some cases, death. Then there were the myths. People believed certain foods caused madness, that overripe plums could bring visions, that unripe grapes stirred melancholy. Garlic, it was said, clouded the mind. Basil, if handled too long, bred scorpions in the brain. These ideas seem strange now, but they came from patterns. Illness followed certain meals, and where knowledge failed, folklore filled the gap. Astrology, too, shaped the table. Physicians consulted the stars before prescribing meals. The moon in Cancer? Avoid dairy. Mars ascendant? Too much pepper might spark violence. Venus in Taurus? Sweet things, but not too many, or love would turn to lust. Herbs were used to protect the body, but also the spirit. Rue and sage were burned in kitchens to ward off evil. Bay leaves were hung in pantries. Rosemary was boiled into teas or tied into bundles above the door. Not for flavor, but for defense. Because some believed that illness entered not through food, but through the devil's breath, slipping in with the steam. When plague swept through towns, entire pantries were burned. Marketplaces closed. Some people fasted out of fear. Others turned to wild cures, drinking vinegar, swallowing crushed pearls, or eating ashes mixed with honey. But food fraud was not always mystical. Vendors sometimes stretched flour with chalk. Meat was soaked in blood to mask its age. Ale was watered, spiced with sap, or thickened with flour to seem heartier. Authorities tried to intervene. City inspectors patrolled markets, testing weights and sniffing barrels. Bakers caught cheating on size or quality were fined, or worse, pilloried in the square, with loaves tied around their necks. But enforcement was inconsistent, and hunger made even the risky tempting. One infamous case from 1385 involved a London pie seller who was caught using dog meat. He was banned from the city, but returned weeks later under a false name. His new pies sold just as well, and yet, despite the danger, people ate, because they had to, because even questionable food was better than none, and because over time they learned. Patterns emerged. Tricks were passed down. Boil the milk if it smells odd. Don't eat oysters on a warm day. Never trust meat that's too red. And so, out of necessity, came caution. Out of caution, rituals. Mothers fed infants bits of chewed bread, pre-softened in their mouths. Travelers carried cloves and vinegar, used to cleanse cups or disguise bad wine. Monks stored grains with lavender or sage to repel pests. Before every feast, noblemen prayed, not just out of gratitude, but in fear. Because food was never just food. It was a risk, a test, a gamble between hunger and harm. As we near the end of our journey, we'll return once more to the quiet. This time, not of a monastery, but of a lone figure by candlelight, a cook, a scribe, a dreamer, and a final reflection on how junk food, its warmth, its sweetness, its danger, reveals who we were. But, for now, rest easy, the fire is low, the pot is clean, and the breath between meals is soft. Night has settled, not just over the town or the cloisters, but across the fields and hills and fading memories of our long journey. The markets are shuttered, the manor kitchens dark. Even the abbey bells have gone silent. And somewhere, in a small room with a stone hearth and a single flame, a figure leans over a parchment. He is neither noble nor peasant, not a monk nor a street vendor, just a man who remembers. The firelight flickers across his hands as he dips a quill into ink. He writes not of kings or battles, but of recipes, of things once tasted, now gone. A sugared fig, a fried curd cake from a fair, a bitter brew boiled from herbs in his mother's garden. These are the memories that cling longest. Not glory, but flavor. Not sermons, but scent. And in that way, perhaps junk food tells us more about the past than any chronicle or decree. Because junk food, whatever name it wore in its time, was never really about waste. It was about craving, about joy, about defiance in the face of want. In a world where life was short and work was endless, it offered something rare, immediacy, pleasure, a hot bite in a cold hour, a sweet thing in a bitter world. It's easy now to scoff at the pies made of crow, the sugared swans, the honey-drenched fritters, to laugh at beaver as fish, or puffins on Lenten tables. But those choices, strange as they seem, were answers to hunger, to rules, to the longing for more than gruel, more than prayer, more than survival. That's what junk food has always been, a small rebellion and a fragile joy. The fritter on the street, bought with your last coin. The marzipan castle built to impress a rival court. The onion tart shared between friends before the last bell. These moments remind us that even in eras of suffering, people still reached for sweetness, for flavor, for something unnecessary and deeply human. And that doesn't change, not with time, not with empire, not even with knowledge. Today we talk of health, of discipline, of balance. We count and measure and label. But somewhere, even now, someone is frying dough at midnight. Someone is breaking a fast not because they're weak, but because they need comfort. And someone is remembering a flavor long after they've forgotten the recipe. Food is history, and junk food, unapologetic, indulgent, joyful, is its most honest footnote. So let this be the end of our journey and the beginning of rest. The market is gone. The court is quiet. The abbey sleeps. Let the parchment dry. Let the last coals turn to ash. And let the memories of distant kitchens and sweet forgotten things settle softly in your mind. If you've enjoyed this quiet walk through the odd corners of the medieval table, I invite you to leave a like or subscribe for more stories just like this one. Your company, even in silence, means more than you know. Now, sleep well, and may your dreams be warm and just a little bit sweet.